Episode 32. Was the French Revolution worth the human cost? An AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Once and Future Present. Finals week is basically here, winter break is finally almost here, and today we're ending the semester with one of the biggest historiographical debates in European history. Over the last few episodes, we've talked about the French Revolution, the Terror, Haiti, and Napoleon, but now we're stepping back and asking a much bigger question. Was all of it actually worth it? Dr. Morgan, Professor Theo, thanks for being here.
Glad to be here, Miles. This is one of those questions historians have been arguing about for more than 2 centuries.
And it's also a question that changes depending on what people value most. Political equality? Stability? Human life? Social change? Different historians weigh those things differently.
And our 2 historians today definitely do not agree.
Not even a little.
One of them, Peter Kropotkin, argues that the revolution destroyed feudalism and absolutism and helped spread liberty across Europe. The other, Simon Schama, argues that the revolution became consumed by violence and failed to deliver many of the changes it promised.
So this isn't really about memorizing dates.
Not primarily, no. This is about historical interpretation. Both historians agree that the revolution mattered enormously. The disagreement is about whether its long-term consequences justified the suffering and violence.
And honestly, after learning about the Terror and the wars and Haiti this year, that feels like a hard question to answer.
Historians struggle with it too.
So where does Kropotkin start?
Kropotkin begins with the argument that people who criticize the revolution focus too much on the violence and not enough on the transformations that followed. He says France, after 1789, was fundamentally different from France before the revolution.
And he especially focuses on peasants. Before the revolution, peasants across much of Europe still faced feudal obligations. They paid dues to landlords, owed labor services, and lived under systems that gave nobles enormous legal and economic power.
So when Kropotkin talks about abolishing feudalism, he means ending those old obligations?
Exactly. He argues that the revolution helped destroy the old feudal order and gave peasants greater independence and dignity.
He describes peasants reclaiming land from nobles and the church during the revolution. He sees that as one of the most important turning points in modern European history.
Kropotkin even talks about how peasants, who had once been terrified of noble authority, suddenly began acting like political participants. He describes peasants bringing Louis XVI back to Paris after the failed flight to Varennes, and argues that ordinary people had developed a new sense of independence and public responsibility.
So for Kropotkin, the revolution changes the mentality of society, not just the laws.
Exactly. He thinks the revolution transformed how ordinary people understood themselves. A peasant who once saw himself as a subject under a lord now increasingly saw himself as a citizen with rights and political importance.
And he thinks that made the violence worth it?
Essentially, yes. Kropotkin argues that revolutions are painful but historically necessary. He compares them to giant leaps forward in human progress.
There's a very 19th century view of history in his writing. He believes societies move through stages, and revolutions accelerate progress when old systems refuse to reform themselves.
So kind of like pressure building until something explodes?
Exactly. Kropotkin argues that by 1789, absolutism and feudalism were already dying systems. He says reform might have been possible earlier, but once elites resisted change for too long, revolution became unavoidable.
And that matters because Kropotkin is not defending violence for its own sake. He's arguing that the violence resulted from the refusal of privileged groups to surrender power peacefully.
That actually sounds similar to some of the Enlightenment ideas we talked about earlier this year.
Very much so. The revolution inherited ideas from the Enlightenment about equality, citizenship, rights, and popular sovereignty.
Kropotkin also talks a lot about the revolution spreading ideas across Europe, right?
Yes. He argues that the French Revolution didn't just change France. He says it accelerated the destruction of serfdom and absolutism across Europe.
He points to the spread of representative government and legal equality. Even after Napoleon fell, many revolutionary reforms survived.
So even though kings came back after Napoleon, Europe couldn't fully go backward?
Exactly. That's one of Kropotkin's strongest arguments. He says the Bourbon monarchy returned, but the old feudal order did not. The social and political landscape had changed permanently.
And remember, Miles, this matters because Europe before the Revolution was still a deeply unequal society built around inherited privilege. Kropotkin sees the Revolution as the moment ordinary people began forcing their way into politics.
I think that's part of what makes this debate hard. Because when you talk about equality and citizenship, those ideas feel modern and important.
They are. And many later democratic and socialist movements looked back to the French Revolution as inspiration.
Kropotkin even argues that later socialist and labor movements inherited ideas from the revolution.
And that's important, because Kropotkin himself was an anarchist, writing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He's looking backward at the French Revolution as the beginning of a much larger struggle for equality and social justice.
So he's not just writing about France, he's writing about the future too.
Very much so. He argues that ideas first discussed during the Revolution later influenced socialism, communism, labor movements, and democratic reform movements throughout Europe.
He also believes the revolution permanently weakened the idea that political authority should come from divine right or inherited privilege. Even conservative governments after Napoleon had to operate in a Europe where people increasingly expected constitutions, representative institutions, and legal equality.
But Sciama pushes back against all of this.
Strongly.
Sciama argues that historians have exaggerated how revolutionary the revolution actually was.
Which sounds strange considering they literally executed a king.
True, but Sciama's point is more complicated than saying nothing changed. He argues that many reforms were already developing before 1789.
For example, he says France was already modernizing under Louis XVI. Economic changes, administrative reforms, and centralization were already happening.
So he's arguing the revolution didn't create modernity from scratch?
Exactly.
Sciama also argues that many elites remained powerful after the revolution. Wealthy landowners often benefited the most from the sale of church and noble lands.
So the poor peasants didn't necessarily benefit as much as revolutionary slogans promised?
That's Sciama's argument. He says many rural poor gained little while wealthier groups consolidated property.
He also argues that the revolution preserved and even expanded centralized state power.
Wait, really?
Yes. Sciama points out that revolutionary governments created new committees, surveillance systems, and emergency powers during the crisis years of the revolution.
Like the Committee of Public Safety?
Exactly. During the Terror, the revolutionary government expanded state authority dramatically. Representatives on mission traveled throughout France enforcing revolutionary policies, while revolutionary tribunals carried out rapid executions.
Sciama argues that this is one of the revolution's greatest contradictions. A movement that began by talking about liberty and the rights of citizens increasingly relied on fear, denunciations, and emergency powers to survive.
Which sounds less like liberty and more like fear.
That's exactly Sciama's point. He argues that revolutionary leaders increasingly believed terror could protect virtue and preserve the revolution.
Sciama also emphasizes how quickly political disagreement became dangerous. During the Terror, people could be executed not only for direct rebellion, but for being accused of weak patriotism or insufficient enthusiasm for the revolution.
That contradiction feels really important.
It's central to the debate.
Because the revolution starts with liberty and rights, but then you end up with executions and surveillance and mass arrests.
And eventually militarization on an enormous scale.
Sciama talks a lot about violence.
He does. In fact, his most famous argument is that violence was not simply an unfortunate side effect of the revolution.
What does he mean by that?
He argues violence became embedded in revolutionary political culture itself.
So not just random chaos?
Correct. Sciama argues that revolutionary rhetoric often glorified violence as necessary for creating a new society.
He points to events like the September massacres, the Terror, and the brutal civil war in the Vendée.
The Vendée was the royalist uprising in Western France?
Yes. Thousands of peasants and Catholics rebelled against the revolutionary government in 1793, partly because of military conscription and hostility toward revolutionary religious policies.
Sciama describes horrifying violence on both sides during that conflict. Executions, massacres, reprisals, and mass shootings became common.
He includes graphic descriptions of Republican forces carrying out mass executions and even using cannon fire against groups of prisoners. Sharma wants readers to confront the scale of revolutionary violence directly instead of treating it as an unfortunate footnote.
And this is part of why his book was controversial, right?
Very controversial. Earlier generations of historians, especially Marxist historians, often emphasized the revolution's social achievements. Sharma shifted attention back toward political violence, contingency, and human suffering.
He also challenged the older idea that the revolution followed some inevitable historical path. Instead, he argues that many events depended on fear, panic, war, and unpredictable decisions made in moments of crisis.
And Sharma thinks this wasn't some temporary breakdown?
Right. He argues violence became part of how revolutionary politics functioned.
One of his most famous lines is essentially that violence was the motor of the revolution.
That's a really dark interpretation.
It is. Sharma argues that once the revolution defined opponents as enemies of the nation, compromise became difficult.
Because if someone is an enemy of the people, then violence starts feeling justified.
Exactly.
And remember, revolutionary France was also fighting major wars against Austria, Prussia, Britain, and other European powers. The government constantly justified emergency powers by pointing to existential threats.
Which honestly sounds familiar.
Historically, states under crisis often expand surveillance, policing, and executive power.
So Sharma is basically warning that revolutions can create systems that become more violent than people expected?
Yes, and he also argues that revolutionary idealism itself sometimes contributed to the violence.
How?
Sharma believes revolutionary leaders became obsessed with virtue and purity. If the revolution was supposed to create a perfect republic, then anyone accused of corruption or disloyalty became dangerous.
That mindset intensified during the terror under Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety.
It's weird because earlier this semester, the Enlightenment seemed so focused on reason.
That's part of Sharma's argument, too. He thinks revolutionary politics became emotional, theatrical, and increasingly radicalized.
So where does Napoleon fit into all of this?
Both historians see Napoleon differently.
Kropotkin sees Napoleon as someone who spread many revolutionary reforms across Europe, even while becoming authoritarian himself.
Sharma, meanwhile, argues Napoleon represented the militarized state created by the revolution.
So for Sharma, Napoleon isn't really betraying the revolution?
Not entirely. Sharma argues militarized nationalism and centralized state power were already growing during the revolution itself.
That's honestly uncomfortable because people usually want revolutions to have a clear good guy versus bad guy story.
History is rarely that simple.
So where do historians today usually land on this question?
Many historians today fall somewhere between Kropotkin and Sharma.
Most historians agree the French Revolution transformed political culture. Ideas about citizenship, nationalism, legal equality, and popular sovereignty spread across Europe and beyond.
But many historians also agree with Sharma that older Marxist interpretations sometimes overstated how completely the revolution transformed society.
And probably fewer historians today are comfortable ignoring the violence.
Definitely. 20th century history changed how historians think about revolutionary violence.
Because after things like Stalin and Hitler and genocide, historians became more cautious about saying violence is justified by some future utopia?
Exactly.
The 20th century made historians much more skeptical of arguments claiming mass suffering is necessary for historical progress.
But at the same time, it's also hard to imagine modern democracy developing the same way without the French Revolution.
And that's why this debate continues.
I keep thinking about something we talked about in the Haiti episode too. The revolution talked about liberty and equality, but France still struggled with slavery and colonialism.
That contradiction became one of the great tests of revolutionary ideals.
And it reminds us that revolutions are often messy and incomplete. They create new possibilities, but they also reproduce old inequalities.
So if you asked both historians whether the revolution mattered, they'd both say yes.
Absolutely.
The disagreement is about whether the gains justified the suffering.
And honestly, I don't know if there's a clean answer.
There probably isn't.
I think what makes this episode feel different is that we've spent this whole semester learning about these events step by step, and now we're asking whether all of it, the terror, the wars, the executions, Haiti, Napoleon, actually led to something better.
That's one of the biggest questions historians can ask.
All right, let's wrap things up there. Today, we looked at two very different interpretations of the French Revolution. Peter Kropotkin argued that the revolution destroyed feudalism and absolutism and helped spread ideas like liberty, equality, and citizenship across Europe. Simon Schama argued that many changes were already underway before 1789 and that violence became central to revolutionary politics itself. We also talked about how historians debate continuity versus change, whether revolutionary violence was unavoidable, and how later events in the 19th and 20th centuries shaped the way historians interpret the revolution. Next episode, we'll explore the origins of the Industrial Revolution and examine why industrialization first developed in Britain. And honestly, after spending a semester covering everything from the late Middle Ages to the French Revolution, I think winter break is definitely earned.
I think your class would agree with that.
Probably enthusiastically.
Thanks for listening to the Once and Future Present, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions.